All right, can you all hear me? Okay. All right, my name is Kimberly Schlarman. I'm the genealogy and local history librarian, and I'll be presenting tonight's program on Indigenous Glenview. Just a few housekeeping things for everyone. Tonight's program is hybrid, so can you hear me now? So we do have people who are watching online, and we have people here in the library who are watching. For everyone online, feel free to put in your comments into the chat box. And it looks like most people can hear, so I'm sorry, Jamie, you might need to adjust your own speakers. But I'm alone tonight, so I'm not going to be able to monitor the chat, unfortunately, quite as much as I normally would. But please feel free to put anything in the chat and I will answer it. And I'll answer it at the end of the program. For the people here in the library, just one bit of housekeeping stuff. We do have a T-coil hearing loop. So if you have a hearing aid and you need assistance with hearing, you can turn your T-coil on, and that should help you with hearing. Okay. So with all of that, so yeah, tonight's program is on Indigenous Glenview, and it's a history of the American Indian tribes in the North Shore. And I wanted to start out with the library's land acknowledgement. So the Glenview Public Library is located on land that has been primarily inhabited by the Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, and Sac Meskwaki nations. Other nations also consider this their traditional homeland, including the Kickapoo, Peoria, Myamia, and Ochedi-Sakowin. This region has a long history as a trading center and migration route, and was important for many different Native peoples. As a civic institution whose core values include inclusion and perpetual learning, we acknowledge their heritage and contributions, and we encourage everyone to learn more about the histories and cultures of all of the Indigenous peoples who have called and continue to call this land home. So today I just want to give just a general overview of the history of the peoples that we mention in this land acknowledgement. It's going to be a very broad history. I don't have time to get into specifics. I also want to say that I am not an expert on Native American history and culture, but I am the local history librarian here. I do local history presentations and research for the library and also for the Glenview History Center. And one of the things that I noticed was that the official histories for the village of Glenview don't really mention a lot of the Native peoples who were here. There's usually like a brief paragraph, and then it kind of, flows into, so it's like most of our history starts in 1830. And I basically want to say that our history starts much earlier than that. And this it's not a correction to that, but it's basically the beginning of a conversation, the beginning of research to kind of include more Indigenous peoples into our village history. So I also want to say that most of what we know about populations who were here come from reports of European traders, settlers, missionary surveyors, all of that. There are some archaeological sites to back up this evidence. And then we also have the traditions and accounts of the Indigenous peoples themselves. That being said, it's still difficult to know exactly where villages were located, where tribes were living, especially the further back in time we go. So I do want to say that if I don't mention a specific tribe, it doesn't mean that they weren't living here, they didn't have a presence here. It's just, it's just that maybe I didn't have evidence for it at some point. So to get started, there were human populations here as early as 12,000 years ago. I'm not going to go that far back. I just want to mention a couple of the earliest civilizations that we do have records for. The first one is the Hopewell Culture. They were based predominantly in the Midwest. from about 100 BCE to, what was it, 500 CE. They were mound builders. They created large earthworks, some effigy mounds. Effigy mounds would be the animal-shaped mounds, right? Most of their sites are in Ohio, but they also had a presence here in northern Illinois. The Mississippian culture basically rose out of the Hopewell culture around 700 CE. They began dying off around 1500 CE. They were also mound builders. Their most famous mounds are at Cahokia. This is a photo of Cahokia. Their mounds were meant to hold temples at the top of them. And Cahokia was, of course, located in Illinois, east of St. Louis. And it was a fairly large city at its height in 1200 CE, or at least it was guesstimated to be that big. The Mississippian was focused on the Mississippi River, but their influence ranged from Wisconsin to Alabama. And this is a map from the Newberry Library that shows some of the ancient earthworks that we know are in the Chicago region. Most of them were along the Des Plaines River. The closest one is to us, I believe, would have been in Lakeview. There was evidence of a lizard mound that was located there. There's some debate about who actually built the mounds in the Chicago region, if they were Hopewell, if they were Mississippian, or if they were a more modern civilization. We know that the Potawatomi liked to build their funerary mounds on top of older earthworks. So there's still some scholarly debate going on over who built these. The Ho-Chunk also believe that they descended from the mound builders who are here. So I want to talk a little bit about the geography of this region and how it related to the more modern Indian tribes that we know. So archaeological evidence and Native American oral tradition indicate that the Great Lakes region had long been a center for trade and communication between the Great Plains, the Hudson Bay, and the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico. So the theory is that basically you could take a canoe from like the mouth of the St. Lawrence River and go all the way through the Great Lakes region and then down to the Mississippi River and go out at the Gulf of Mexico. That's the theory anyway. There were various languages that were spoken in this region, but they all had common dialects. So that allowed for easy trade and travel. And I like this map, which is also by the Newberry, that shows all of the water routes that were in the Great Lakes region. And it also mentions some of the tribes that were present here. To focus in a little bit more on Chicago, the low watershed of this region flooded during rainy seasons during the spring and fall. So that facilitated canoe travel through this area. So the portage and river junctures became sites of trading posts, villages, forts. Northern Illinois was also very well suited for agriculture. Corn, squash, and beans were grown here. Tobacco and wild rice could also be grown. And bison were also plentiful in the region. So some tribes came here just for the summer hunting season. So basically during the spring and fall, you would have a lot of different tribes following these water routes through this area who had a lot of movement, a lot of temporary camps set up as they were heading to trading posts or just for migrating. During the summer, you would have tribes that had more semi-permanent camps here who were just here for their bison hunts. And then in winter, you would have tribes who would come from like, say, but you would have tribes that would come from upper Michigan and Canada who would come here. They were basically, snowbirds. They would come here because the weather was warmer than it was up in Canada or in Lake Superior. So, and then you had tribes who lived here year-round who participated in agriculture and who had permanent camps in this region. So there were a lot of different tribes here. Sometimes they were living together, if even temporarily, but you had a lot of people coming and going. And I don't know if multi-ethnic is the right word, but it was, you had a diversity of tribes in the region. So these water routes, to connect to these water routes, you had land trails. And there were 3 major land trails in Glenview. which I'll talk about a little bit more later, but Waukegan Road, Glenview Road, and Milwaukee Avenue were the three big trails in this region. And these trails were marked by trail marker trees. And trail marker trees were bent as saplings into a horizontal shape to the trail, and they were used to mark exits for a village or to show where a freshwater spring was. They might show you where the best place to cross a river was. But in 1905, there were still references to 2 or 3 trees along the North Branch Trail of the river by the Glenview Club. And it's believed that they were marking trails to a village that was located at the Glenview Club. We also know that there was one located by the Kennecott Homestead at the Grove, which would have been on the Milwaukee Avenue trail. And so this is a photo from what one would have looked like in Deerfield. I know some suggest that there might still be some trail marker trees that still exist, but I think when they've been tested or like when they've tried to determine their age, it's been determined that they're too young to actually be trail marker trees. So I don't think any of these still exist in the area, at least in Glenview. So one of the first major tribes that we know that inhabited northern Illinois is the Ho-Chunk. You might know them as the Winnebago. The Winnebago is actually an Algonquin word that means people of the dirty waters. So the French encountered an Algonquin tribe and they said, oh, those are the people of the dirty waters. They think dirty waters may have been Lake Winnebago or the Fox River. It was derogatory. It's not what they call themselves. They call themselves Ho-Chunk, which means people of the first voice. The Ho-Chunk are a Siouan speaking tribe, which was a little unusual for this area. Most of the tribes in this region spoke an Algonquin language. Most Siouan speaking tribes live further west of the Mississippi, so they're more Great Plains Indians. The tribes in this region were considered Eastern Woodland Indians, and the Ho-Chunk is considered an Eastern Woodland Indian. They just speak a Siouan, a Great Plains language. So they were based in eastern Wisconsin and northeastern Illinois. And Ho-Chunk oral history states that their first village is located near what is now Green Bay, Wisconsin. And they also state that there was an influx of Ojibwe into that region in the mid-16th century. And this forced the Ho-Chunk to expand further south. And this is probably when they would have ended up in the Glenview area. So mid-1500s is when they may have showed up here. Unlike a lot of their neighbors, the Ho-Chunk would create large permanent villages. They lived in bark lodges like what you see here, and they practiced agriculture. Some early Glenview settlers, particularly John Wagner and the people who had the farms around in that region, they said that they found funerary mounds when they were tilling their land, building their houses. They believed, for whatever reason, that they were Ho-Chunk funerary mounds. Unfortunately, I know John Wagner cremated all of the bodies that he found, and I don't know if any of the artifacts or anything that was found still exist. So it's kind of, I don't know that we're able to actually prove who built those mounds, but the early settlers claimed they were Ho-Chunk mounds. So the French began exploring in North America in the mid-1500s, but they didn't establish permanent settlements until the 1600s. But they integrated themselves with indigenous nations so they could learn about trails and waterways and how to navigate North America. So French explorer Jean Nicolet, he encountered the Ho-Chunk in Green Bay at 1634. That's the first recorded meeting between a European and a Midwestern tribe, at least in this region of the country. Nicolet, for whatever reason, believed that the Ho-Chunk were a seafaring people, and he thought that they knew of a water route from Wisconsin to the Pacific, and he wanted to go to China. The Ho-Chunk showed him the Fox River, and I guess he wasn't impressed with that, so he went back to Quebec. But that was the first meeting between the Ho-Chunk and the Europeans. We know that Europeans were probably exploring this area in the 1630s. And then in the 1670s, they began exploring southern Lake Michigan. But 1673 was the first official recorded contact with the French. That was, of course, with Marquette and Joliet. So I really love these old French maps. I don't know how well you can see this, but they have some really great illustrations, some weird birds and things. But they do show you, at least give you a general idea of where some of the tribes were living. They point out some of the villages along the Chicago River. There were a lot of villages along the Fox River here. But anyway, these are pretty fun. So the tribes who lived in this region believed that the portages and trails were a shared resource. They weren't owned by any one tribe, and the Europeans were welcome to share in these resources as well. So they shared their knowledge with the French, and Marquette wrote about taking up what is now Milwaukee Avenue. He didn't make it as far as Glenview, but he did take that trail out a ways. There's also a story that he took the west fork of the North Branch of the Chicago River up through Glenview. That's again one of those stories that hasn't been proven. But if he did come up here, he would have just been following traditional Native American trails and waterways. Just a little bit on the fur trade. Demand for furs was high in Europe across the 17th and 18th centuries, and the fur trade became the major economic activity for Native Americans and Europeans here in America. So the Europeans would trade goods such as guns and other metalworks for pelts, particularly beaver pelts. And the fur traders often married indigenous women, and intermarriage ensured strategic communal relationships. Algonquin tribes had long used intermarriage to strengthen their trading partnerships with other tribes. So they basically just did the same with the French. And the children of these marriages are called Métis. And the Métis were important to the Great Lakes region for communication, trade, and diplomacy. They usually spoke French and several dialects of indigenous languages, and many of the earliest settlers in the city of Chicago, or what became the city of Chicago, would be Métis. But of course, not everything was great with the French arriving. It created a lot of competition for resources, for land, and in upstate New York, New England, Canada, there was a League of Iroquois, or the Iroquois Confederacy. And this was a group of Iroquoian-speaking tribes in that region who decided that they were sort of being pushed by the French traders and also the British and the Dutch traders, or British and the Dutch settlers who were coming into that region. They decided that it would be beneficial for them if they would just start monopolizing the fur trade, because that would give them some protection from the French and also a source of economy, right? So during the 1640s and 50s, they began raiding the tribes in the Great Lakes region, the Algonquin-speaking tribes. And this pushed a lot of the Algonquin-speaking tribes further west and south, so more into this region. And this had an impact on the Ho-Chunk. So the Ho-Chunk numbers began dwindling after that first meeting with Europeans. And that's probably because of disease, but also because of increased fighting with these new Algonquin tribes who were coming into the region. So they were pushed further south and west throughout the 1600s. They did regain population in the 1700s, partially due to intermarriage with other Algonquin tribes, but their influence in this area began to diminish. But they were replaced by other tribes, like the Sac. And Sac is short for Asakawaki, which means yellow earth people. And they are an Algonquin-speaking tribe. And in the 1600s, they moved from their homelands in Michigan into Wisconsin. And the Sac tribe is, of course, closely related to the Meskwaki or Fox tribe or nation. And Meskwaki means red earth people. They're called Fox or Renard by the French. The theory is that the French probably met one clan of this nation, and that clan said that, oh, we're the Fox clan, and the French are just like, okay, you're all the Fox people. So that's how they ended up with that nickname. They're also Algonquin speaking, and their homelands were a little bit further east near Lake Ontario, but like the Sac, they had migrated to Wisconsin by the 1600s. So now the Meskwaki were the largest Algonquin tribe to frequently fight against the French. And the French didn't like the Meskwaki because the Meskwaki would charge tolls to use the Fox River, and the French didn't want to do that. The Ojibwe were also longtime enemies of the Meskwaki people. And the French at this point were integrated into indigenous society enough to know exactly who to manipulate to get what they wanted. So they teamed up with the Ojibwe with the express intention of just completely eradicating the Meskwaki from northern Wisconsin. And unfortunately, it worked. The Meskwaki were first forced further south, and they began living with the Sac. So the Sac and Meskwaki officially became allies in 1733. They probably would have moved into this area because of these fights with the French and the Ojibwe sometime into the 1700s, early 1700s. We know by 1769 that they had fought the Illinois Confederation and had completely driven them out of northern Illinois, and they officially moved into those territories in northern Illinois in 1769. And they would fight against several other tribes throughout the 18th century, further south of us, the Shawnee, the Missouri, and the Myamia. I did find a reference to a battle in a 1903 article in the Chicago Evening Post by Carl Dilg. He was a journalist and amateur historian and archaeologist, but he had this very brief mention that I would love to learn more about. But he mentioned that the Sac and Meskwaki tribes descended upon the Myamia and the French, and they were determined to destroy everything. And this all happened at what's now the Glenview Club. I would love to learn more about that, but I'm gonna have to go to Carl Dilg's. He has some manuscripts at the History Museum. So I wanna get to that at some point to learn more about that battle. But anyway, the Meskwaki had a specific, they had a reputation for being warriors in this area, let's put it that way. So the Chicago region emerged as a trading center in the early 1700s. And this is also when some semi-permanent European settlements began to show up. One that I want to mention is a French Catholic mission that opened by Father Pierre-François Pinet, and that opened in what is now Indian Hill Golf Club, which is in Winnetka. It opened in 1696. It didn't last very long. It was abandoned in the early 1700s, but that mission was there specifically to convert specifically a nearby village. And that village would have been in northern Glenview, sort of by Watersmeet Woods. It was either a Myamia or a Potawatomi tribe. But I thought it was interesting because a lot of these early accounts don't really tell you how many people were living in these villages, but he noted that there were over 150 cabins in this village. You would have had one or two families living in each cabin, so that does give you a little bit of an idea of how many people would have been living there at that time. So here's another good French map. But with the end of the French and Indian War in 1763, this area, of course, came under British rule. Also, after that time, you began getting some of the more settlements, the more famous settlements that you may know. Jean-Baptiste Point de Sable built his cabin at the mouth of the Chicago River in 1779. De Sable's wife is thought to have been Potawatomi. For this region, Antoine Wilmette and his Métis wife, they arrived in Chicago in 1790, but they didn't come to Wilmette until 1826. Okay, so the Council of the Three Fires, this is the tribe that's probably the most well-known in this region. And we don't know if these were originally one group of people or a group of people who are very closely related, but anyway, this is a very long standing alliance of three Algonquin-speaking tribes. The first one is the Ojibwe. They're also called the Chippewa or the Saulteaux. It's lost. No one knows what Ojibwe exactly means. But according to the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, Ojibwe were the first in igniting the flames of the council. They were considered the elder brothers in this group, or are considered the elder brothers in this group. The Ottawa were second to build a fire as one people, and they were considered the keepers and protectors of their trade networks. Ottawa does mean trader. And the Potawatomi they were the last group to join. They're considered the younger brother in the group. And their name comes from their role in the council, which is keepers of the sacred fire. And today they still consider it important to keep the flames of their past alive. So the Ojibwe would have been located along the northern Great Lakes. Lake Superior, northern Wisconsin, maybe into Minnesota. They were the most northern. The Ottawa would have been based a little bit further east and south, kind of by Lake Ontario, and also the southern peninsula of Michigan. And the Potawatomi were sort of below that. Although their oral tradition says that their homelands were around the St. Lawrence River, that was probably true for all three tribes. But we know that they were living in Michigan at the time of first European contact. And then they just basically throughout the 1600s moved, they moved up into the Upper Peninsula and then down the east coast of Wisconsin. And then they had settled in this region by 1700. So the Potawatomi were heavily involved in the French fur trade, and they developed close economic and familial ties with the French. And the French traders would often live amongst them in their villages. Other tribes would have lived amongst them too, particularly the Ottawa and the Ojibwe. They would have lived in their villages. Their villages were usually smaller and near rivers, which kind of made the Chicago area a good place for them to have lived, because we have a lot of small rivers. I also wanted to mention that the Potawatomi had advanced agricultural practices. They grew crops, particularly wheat and corn, to feed their families, but also to sell to fur traders and missionaries in the area. They would also trade furs for plows, and that allowed them to develop large plots of land. And one of the reasons that I wanted to mention this is because there's this pervasive idea that this area was prairie and marsh and wilderness, and it wasn't until the American settlers showed up that we did anything with it. And that's really not true. When the Americans began arriving in the 1800s, this area already had agricultural areas, and that's one reason why they wanted to settle here, was because they knew the land was the soil was fertile, because the Potawatomi had demonstrated that. So I think that's important to keep in mind when we're thinking about what this area would have looked like in the 1800s when people were showing up here. And I'll go into that a little bit more later. So this is the Scharf Map. And Albert F. Scharf, he was a historian and cartographer who mapped out the villages, trails, and landmarks that were in this region supposedly around 1804. He was doing this research in the late 1800s, the 1890s. He published this map in 1900. He was also an associate with Carl Dilg, who had mentioned that battle at the Glenview Club. So I have a better view of this map for you to look at in a minute. And this is just a portion of this map. This map covers Cook County, Will County, and Kane County. So this is just the northern and eastern part of it. But he did a lot of intensive research on this. And there's also an index included with it where he told you a little bit about how he found and how he determined where these things were. And these villages here would have been Potawatomi villages. So to get into what we learn about Indigenous Glenview from this map, there were three prominent trails in this region. Like I mentioned earlier, Glenview Road would have been the most prominent. It was sometimes called Deer Trail or Lake Trail, but it would have connected Lake Michigan, the North Branch of the Chicago River, and the Des Plaines River. It's one of the oldest and most important trails in the region. So it's kind of cool that we're sitting here, on something that's been used for at least 500 years. So that's right outside our door right now. There was also the Little Fort Trail, that is Waukegan Road. Waukegan is the Little Fort in that trail. And then Milwaukee Avenue, which I guess didn't have a name, but that was also a prominent trail. And then there were three villages in or around Glenview. The more famous one is the one at the Glenview Club. There was also one kind of by Oakton Community College, although in Scharf's index, he says this was actually two villages with a camp in between. So there would have been a village south of where Rand Road meets the river there. And then there would have been a camp in between, and then another village just north of that. And then at Lake Avenue and Wagner, there was one at Lake Avenue and Wagner Run. That's the one by Wagner Farm or Watersmeet Woods. There would have been a smaller village in that region. And then there was one camp that we know of in the area at Milwaukee and Glenview Road, and that would have been by the Grove. So here's a map, and I colored this for you to make it a little bit easier to see. The green trails are the prominent trails that go through Glenview. So you can see Glenview Road here that goes through here. The brown trails are other trails that were in the area. And then here you've got Milwaukee Avenue, or I'm sorry, Waukegan Avenue and Milwaukee Avenue here. The yellow are all of the villages that were in the area. The big squares are the big villages. So here's the one in Gulf, and then the one by Oakton. The smaller village is up here, kind of Watersmeet Woods, Wagner Farm area. And then this is the one that would have been by the Grove. There's also marked on here a signal mound. The signal mounds were supposedly built, or signal stations. These were supposedly built by the Meskwaki, and these were basically lookout places, or where they could, set up a fire signal or something if somebody was encroaching on their land. So this was a high point, or it still is a high point at Waukegan and Glenview Road here. I mean, you can see some of the other camps and villages that were in the area. So this is a pretty cool map. I did want to briefly mention the Potawatomi tree. This is sort of I don't want to call it an urban legend. It did actually exist. It was basically this really huge 600-year-old cottonwood tree. It was located on Glenview Road, kind of east by Wilmette. It had it was hollow on the inside, and 31 people could apparently fit inside. So this of course impressed everybody who came through here, and all of these legends saying that it was a Potawatomi tree sprang up. They thought it had some sort of significance with the indigenous populations here. They also called it the Black Hawk tree because they believed that there had been a big war dance there during the Black Hawks War, or they called it the council tree because they assumed that's where everyone would have met. I think by the time that people were actually writing about these trees and writing these stories down, it was assumed that these were all urban legends. They don't think that the Potawatomi actually really used this tree for anything. It was probably a landmark, right? Because it's, how do you miss this thing? But we don't know that it had any actual significance to the Potawatomi and their culture. The tree was, if it died or it was destroyed by a fire in 1903, so it's not there anymore. Obviously, if it was, I'm sure we'd all know it. I do want to briefly mention some of the other tribes that were in this region, starting with the Kickapoo. You may have seen on some of those French maps a tribe called Mascoutin, I'm sorry, but they were sort of related to the Kickapoo and eventually got absorbed by that tribe, which is why I'm mentioning them here as well. But they were Algonquin-speaking people. They were closely related to the Sac Meskwaki tribes, and the tribe had always been based in the Great Lakes region. They were here in the 1600s, but they frequently moved due to competition for land against other tribes. They were frequently here between Wisconsin and Illinois. They moved between those areas. They were one of the first tribes to sort of leave the region. They were one of the first tribes to move further south and west. By the early 1800s, they were living in Texas, and by 1850, they actually had a settlement in Mexico. So the Peoria, they were part of the Illinois Confederation. And the Illinois Confederation, this was a group of Algonquin tribes, 13 Algonquin tribes. I have the biggest listed here. The Peoria was one of the largest tribes. They were also Algonquin speaking. And they were considered important to the French because they were the predominant tribe around the Illinois and the Mississippi rivers. However, they had a lot of conflicts with the Algonquin tribes to the north and east of them, and they also fought a lot with the Dakota, who were on their west. They were also unusual in that they sided with the Americans during the American Revolution. Most of the other tribes in this region did not do that. So they were often at odds with a lot of their neighbors. And by the end of the 18th century, warfare and European diseases had nearly wiped out the Illinois peoples. The Peoria were one of the last remaining tribes, and they ended up settling at the main Kaskaskia village, which is where the Fox River meets the Illinois River. So the Myamia were another Algonquin tribe, and they were based mostly south of the Great Lakes, predominantly in Indiana, but also Western Ohio and Eastern Illinois. Several French explorers had noted that there was once a Myamia village at the mouth of the Great Lakes, at the mouth of the Chicago River. But they had been pushed out by either the Potawatomi or the Sac Meskwaki. And by the early 1700s, they had largely settled on the eastern side of Lake Michigan near St. Joseph, as well as in Indiana and Ohio. But they also potentially had some tribes here in Glenview as well. And then the Oceti-Sakowin, this was a tribe that I was surprised to discover had a presence here in northern Illinois. Oceti-Sakowin means 7 councils fire, and it is a group of Siouan-speaking peoples. The 3 main groups are listed here. They're also called Dakota and Lakota. The name that is usually given to them is Sioux, but Sioux is another one of those Algonquin words that the French used to describe these people. Sioux actually, well, it's a shortened form of a larger Algonquin word, but it means little snakes. So these are our enemies, the little snakes. So this is not what the Oceti-Sakowin call themselves. But the Oceti-Sakowin do consider northern Illinois to be part of their traditional homelands. Northern Illinois really would have been part of their hunting grounds. These would have been their summer hunting grounds. But the Santee, this is the group that would have been living in this area. They lived in small villages on the east and west side of the Mississippi River. And each summer they would participate in the bison hunts in this region. And it was during those bison hunts that they would encounter the Algonquin speaking tribes in this region. And they fought like all the time over land and over hunting grounds. And then that warfare got worse when the Algonquins got guns from the French. So already by 1736, most of the Santee had moved west of the Mississippi. And in 1763, they signed a treaty with the Ojibwe, renouncing their rights to hunt east of the Mississippi. All right. So now we're getting into the late 1700s and when a lot of these tribes began ceding their territory. And for this region, one of the big dates is the 1783 Treaty of Paris. And this is when the Northwest Territory, which is Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, and Wisconsin, when the territory that encompasses those states was given to the newly formed United States. So when that happened, American and European settlers began coming into this region, establishing more settlements, and that's when a lot more warfare would break out between the indigenous populations and these new settlers. The early 1800s also saw the fur trade peak and then diminish. And this loss of economy for Native Americans created their need to negotiate for land in exchange for annuities from the US government. And this here is actually a list of annuities. It lists Potawatomi chiefs that were in this region in 1827 and the annuities that the US government was giving them. For this region, also the 1795 Treaty of Greenville, this was when the Potawatomi sold the tract of land at the mouth of the Chicago River. And then shortly after, in 1803, Fort Dearborn was built at the mouth of the river. And it was meant to protect American fur interests, but it was also built as a defense against the local tribes. So relationships between the Potawatomis and the Americans began deteriorating in the early 1800s. And most Chicago Potawatomi, they sided with the British during the War of 1812. And during that war, when federal troops briefly abandoned Fort Dearborn, the Potawatomi seized the chance to attack the garrison. And 50 Americans and 15 Potawatomi were killed. After that, the Potawatomi began attacking a few other American settlements in the area. But by 1814, they began seeking peace with the US government. And the big treaties for this region well, in the 1820s, miners also rushed into northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin, particularly like around Galena, and warfare would often break out between those miners and the Ho-Chunk who were living in that region. So tensions were pretty high between the settlers and the indigenous populations at this time. So the government started signing these treaties. They signed 3 treaties at the Treaty du Chien. The first one basically just, nobody ceded any land with that treaty. It basically just said, this is Potawatomi land, this is Sac Meskwaki land, this is Ho-Chunk land. It was basically just delineating where everyone was living. And that was in 1825. But with the second treaty in 1829, that's when the Potawatomi ceded about 70% of their land in Illinois. It's when they ceded this land that's all in pink here. This is what would have encompassed Glenview. So basically what this treaty did was it said that the Potawatomi could still hunt on this land, but they basically didn't have any rights to it. This was US government land. They did have some small villages, some reservations, but they weren't allowed to have any large settlements anymore, at least in that part of the land, in that part of Illinois. The third treaty was with the Ho-Chunk, and that's when they gave up this yellow part here. And this is, of course, all leading up to the Black Hawk War. So in 1831, Chief Black Hawk, he was the chief of the Sacs. He was expelled from Illinois, but the following year, he and 2,000 Sac Meskwaki followers, they crossed the Mississippi River. They said that they were coming here for summer planting, but they were attacked by militia anyway. And then after that, of course, warfare ensued. The Ho-Chunks fought alongside the Sac Meskwaki tribes during this war, but 7,000 American troops were involved, and most of Black Hawk's followers were killed. So this was the last major Native rebellion against American settlers in the Chicago area. And so pressure was definitely mounting to just remove Native Americans from this region. So in 1833, the Treaty of Chicago was negotiated. An estimated 3,000 Native Americans, land speculators, government officials, they all came to witness these negotiations. And the negotiations were between the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi and the US government. And they ceded 5 million acres of land, basically in exchange for annuities, a cancellation of their debts, and territory west of the Mississippi. All tribes were given 3 years, starting in 1834, to leave this area. In August 1835, in protest of the treaty, 500 Native American warriors gathered in Chicago for a war dance, and that's the last recorded war dance in the Chicago region. This map is probably really hard to read, but this is a map of all of the Indian Territory in 1836. So this is right after the Treaty of Chicago was signed. To make it a little bit easier for you, the Winnebagos, the Ho-Chunk, they're based in, they were given land in western Wisconsin. The Sauk and Fox were given territory in Iowa, and the Chippewa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi, they were given land kind of by the Missouri River in western Iowa, this small bit of land here. So for context, the Ho-Chunk Nation are still based in Wisconsin, kind of in this region. There is still a Meskwaki Nation in Iowa. There are also Sauk and Fox Nations in Nebraska, Kansas, and Oklahoma. So they were pushed further west. The Potawatomi also ended up in Oklahoma, but some tribes still have lands in Wisconsin and Michigan. But a question, did everyone really leave in the 1830s? If you read a Chicago history book, basically they'll say 1837, everyone's gone, and now let's focus on the new settlers who are here. But in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, several historical societies in Illinois, Chicago, and Evanston, and some other regions, they tried talking with some of the earliest white settlers who would come to this area, and they were trying to determine where some of the villages may have been, where indigenous landmarks were located. And what they found was that a lot of these earliest settlers, they had memories of living amongst the Potawatomi for years after they had lived here. Here's a few mentions of camps here. There was a traditional Potawatomi log cabin on Davis Street in Evanston, where 1 or 2 Potawatomi families were living, and the cornfield that they had at this log cabin survived until the late 19th century. So there were definitely still people in this region. There were people who were still living traditional Potawatomi lifestyles into the 1840s. Here's a quote by Mr. B.F. Hill of Evanston, basically saying that he remembers Potawatomi coming and going all the time, traveling north along the trails, coming by his father's house for calling and trading, hunting expeditions. So this all would have lasted probably throughout the 1840s. And when I was doing research for this, I also found something interesting that we know that Potawatomi labor helped build the city of Chicago. And there's also an essay that I found by Kurt Peters. He wrote in a book called Native Chicago, but he had been doing research on census data in Cook County, trying to determine Native American families that started showing up in the 1870s and 1880s census records. And what he found was that they were listed in 1860 and 1850 census records, but they were listed as mulatto or listed under other racial designations. So he's been doing research into trying to figure out how many Native families would have stayed in this area. So you had a lot of people who did, obviously most people did leave, but there are people who never left. This was their home and they didn't want to go. And so it's not fair to say that everybody left in 1837. There was still a presence here. There's still a presence here. For Glenview specifically, we know that when the first English and American settlers began arriving, in Glenview, that the Potawatomi presence was still strong. Sorry. So George Heslington, he's the first, one of the first settlers that we know who came to this region. He was actually at Fort Dearborn when that treaty was being signed. So he was one of those 3,000 people who came just waiting to get land here. And right after that treaty was signed, he moved into his new property that he bought, which was of course at the Glenview Club. So he basically moved right next to the Potawatomi village. His daughter Jane was born the year after they moved here, and she told her granddaughter that she remembered receiving presents from her Potawatomi neighbors as a child. So they were living, again, as I mentioned before, that the Potawatomi had agricultural practices. They had already cleared the land. This land was already ready to go. It was already ready for farming when George Heslington moved in. The Dews were Heslington's in-laws. They moved to the Glenview Club as well. This is their cabin. It still exists at the 17th hole of the Glenview Club. It is the oldest structure in the area, dates back to 1836. The Kinnecotts we'll talk about in a minute, but they also came in 1836. John Wagner moved to Wagner Farm in 1837. And as we said, there was a small village there, and he apparently also built his farm on a funerary mound. So everybody was basically settling where the Potawatomi had already been living when they got here. And they were often still living amongst them. This is from Albert F. Sharp's manuscript, and it deals specifically with the Kinnecott homestead. And it said that the Kinnecott homestead took its name from the Grove Portage, which was a portage trail. It's not included on his original map, but it was a smaller trail that went from Skokie to the Chicago River to the Des Plaines River. He said it was still visible in 1901. Just north of the Kinnecott house. And he also mentioned that it was a camp for Potawatomi, even in Mr. Kinnecott's time. So when the Kinnecotts first got there, they were still living amongst the Potawatomi. I also found interesting that the Des Plaines River apparently nearly reached Milwaukee Road at that point. And then just for very crude map of downtown Glenview, some of the earliest settlements. The very first store in this area was basically built where the signal station was. It's right here at the corner of Glenview Road and Waukegan Road, right here. And then other houses and settlements were put among those roads. So, I mean, basically Glenview looks the way does today because of what the Potawatomi and what the indigenous peoples in this region had been doing before. That's where all of our some of our major roads come from. Our downtown area is basically based on where these areas meet. So it's important to remember, I think, when we're talking about the history of this region. And just to wrap up, when we're talking about, Native Americans, it's not history, they are still here. And Chicago, this region does have the third largest urban Native American population in the US. There's over 65,000 people here, more than 140 tribal nations represented. Only 0.1% identified as Native American in Glenview, but they are still in the region. So I think it's important to remember that they are here and they've never left. And then because it is Native American Heritage Month, and I'm not an expert on any of this, we do want to encourage people to do further reading, to engage a little bit more in Native American culture where you can. Here are a few books that are sort of specific to this region that I thought were interesting. They're here. The library has also created some book lists that are on our website, fiction and nonfiction by Native American authors. We have displays up. So just for everyone to learn a little bit more if you'd like. And if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to see if I can answer them. Yeah.
At one point, you said something about the miners, and that's one question. And the other question is the tribe. How many people were in the tribe?
All right, so for the people online, the first question was about the miners. Well, I'm sorry, what specifically? Oh. Oh, I don't actually know what they were mining by Newport, to be honest, but they were coming into the Galena region. Or that would be my assumption. Yeah, but that's where they were going, and that was Ho-Chunk land. So that's I know there was a story that I think the miners took some Ho-Chunk women, which of course didn't go over very well for anybody. So there was that started one series of battles, and it never really stopped. And how many people were in a tribe? I don't know that. To be honest, it would have. I mean, the smaller camps were maybe about 50, like 50 teepees. The larger camps could have been much larger than that, but it would have depended. I really don't know offhand. But yeah, there was a question back there. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned it was the site of Indian camp. Is that a Potawatomi camp or a whole chunk camp?
So yeah, so with Wagner Farm, so John Wagner, when he was farming, he found funerary mounds, and he believed those to be Ho-Chunk, but we can't prove that. But that's what he said. He believed that they were Ho-Chunk. Well, he burned them. I mean, that was he admitted that he burned them. So we really don't have a way to verify who they were. But we do know that there was a Potawatomi and potentially a Myamia village in that area. So that area is on the Deerfield Moraine, and it's a little bit taller than some of the other areas in this region. So yeah, right. So we know that there were a lot of encampment or a lot of villages in that area. So there probably could have been others besides Potawatomi and Myamia, but those are the two that at least the last tribe that was there was Potawatomi. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
During your research, did you find any mention of individual Indian names when the French and early explorers when they would record their encounters with the local
Yeah, so the question was if there are, if the French ever recorded individual names during their encounters. They did. I didn't find any specific to this region, so I honestly didn't note them, or at least specific to Glenview or the North Shore, so I didn't note those down. But yeah, they would note down specific names if they found them. Yeah. Yeah.
The Indians, I think, in 1836, 7 period,
Mhm.
the Indians from around here,
Mhm.
forced on the Trail of Tears.
The Trail of Tears, I believe, was that was further south. Yeah, that didn't. No, they didn't go through that. No. Mhm.
Where your map showed 2 walls in the middle of Michigan. And I found that really strange.
2 walls. Oh, yeah, some of the maps would show, they show like weird mounds and things. I think those are like high points. I don't know if that's what you saw on the map.
They had printed out a map.
Oh, if it said walls on the map, it could have been a fort, maybe, or perhaps an earthworks or something. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know.
Really, a question about tribes
Mm-hmm.
said that some of the tribes came on a seasonal basis for the bison.
Mm-hmm.
Where were they coming from and where were they going to? In other words, did they start in Minnesota and Michigan or?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So the question was about bison hunting, and where those tribes who were coming here to hunt bison were coming from. So like the Santee and the Dakota, they were coming from west of the Mississippi to come to this region. You would have had tribes, I think a lot of tribes from Wisconsin would come down here for hunting. I don't know of anybody from the South coming up here. I think there were possibly better lands further south, but I know definitely from the West and definitely from the South, they were coming to hunt the bison.
And it was seasonal in terms of like once a year that happened?
Yeah, they would come here in the summer for those hunts. It was seasonal. Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? If anyone has anything online. Someone online did ask if I've written this information down. I've not written it down, but I did record this presentation, so it will be available on our YouTube page. I hope to write it down at some point. I want to do a little bit more research, flesh it out a little bit. This was just kind of a beginning to sort of just kind of an introduction into who was here, and I'd hope to get more Glenview specific going further. But oh, thank you very much. Well, yeah. All right. There's nothing else. Nobody has anything else online. I'm going to end the webinar, but thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah.